emblemática escena de la novela de Nikos Kazantzakis, Sorba el griego. Sorba es un campesino del mundo rural, un analfabeto, que no ha leído nunca libros, y que se encuentra con el intelectual, el hombre que ha leído todos los libros, Nikos Kazantzakis, y le pregunta ansioso a Nikos Kazantzakis: dígame, patrón, ¿qué significado tienen todas las cosas? ¿Existe un Dios? Y sobre todo, ¿por qué morimos? Entonces el intelectual Nikos Kazantzakis le contesta: no lo sé, Sorba. Entonces Sorba lo mira y le dice: entonces, ¿para qué sirven todos los libros que usted ha leído? Y Kazantzakis, de una manera muy intelectual, le contesta: esos libros hablan de la perplejidad del hombre ante las grandes preguntas. Y Sorba el griego, encolerizado, golpea el suelo con un pie y dice: me importa un comino la perplejidad del hombre. Sorba el griego quería respuestas. El hombre siempre ha hecho preguntas que le han quemado el corazón, desde siempre. Los niños nos hacen preguntas que a veces no podemos responder. Parece que hubo un tiempo en que la filosofía respondía a algunas preguntas, o por lo menos encaminaba hacia esa respuesta. Pero parece que hace mucho tiempo que la filosofía ya no da respuesta a la pregunta que se hace la mayoría de los seres humanos que no estudian en las academias de filosofía. Y para conversar sobre la relación entre la filosofía y la vida, entre el uso práctico, directo, en ese tesoro que es el pensamiento humano, como un capital disponible para cada uno de nosotros, para responder las preguntas que nos queman todos los días, tenemos la suerte de tener aquí en el programa a Lou Marinoff, profesor de filosofía en el City College de Nueva York, presidente y fundador de la Asociación de Filósofos, consultores de filosofía. Esa sería en realidad la verdadera definición. Es conferenciante, es educador, un apasionado de la filosofía, y ha publicado un libro que produjo un remesón de alguna manera en el mundo académico, que es, y que lleva por título, Más Platón y Menos Prozac. La mayoría de nosotros conocemos el Prozac, no sé si todos conocemos a Platón. El Prozac se ha hecho muy popular en el último tiempo, lamentablemente en nuestro mundo. Este libro tiene más de 200.000 ejemplares vendidos. Y Lou Marinoff acaba de publicar Pregúntale a Platón, cómo la filosofía puede cambiar tu vida. Quiero agradecerle a Lou Marinoff su presencia aquí en esta conversación.
You're very welcome, Christian.
Lo primero quería preguntarle, te puedo tutear, ¿no, Lou?
Sí.
Sin problema, ok. Lo primero que quisiera preguntarte es, ¿cuál es tu reacción a este diálogo entre Sorba, el griego, el analfabeto que quiere responder las preguntas, y Nikos Kazantzakis, el intelectual, que por honestidad intelectual tal vez habla de la perplejidad, pero no da respuesta a las preguntas del hombre?
This is a beautiful anecdote, and it illustrates the two facets of the human being, which are complementary, like two sides of a coin. We have the so-called peasant, the uncultured man of great instinct and common sense, who nonetheless has faith in what he cannot understand. And we have the other side, which is the cultured man of the world, the sophisticated intellectual, the man who's read too much, perhaps. And for him this has raised only doubts. So when Nietzsche says that man is on a rope, or is a rope stretched across an abyss between beast and God, this is where we find ourselves, between Sorba and Kazantzakis.
Ahora, Lou, de alguna manera lo que tú has hecho en tus libros es tender de nuevo un puente entre la filosofía, el pensamiento y la vida cotidiana. ¿Cuándo se produjo esa separación entre el pensamiento y la vida cotidiana, entre las preguntas de los filósofos y las necesidades de respuestas de la gente común y corriente?
Now, this is a very good question, too. And historians will argue about the precise date. But I think it's something that began early in the 20th century. And it began really with the successes of science and technology applied particularly to the social domain. The extension of positivism and the hope that just as natural sciences gave us great explanatory power over processes in physics and chemistry and biology, so it was the hope in the 19th century that so-called social sciences would explain the human psyche, sociology, economics, and politics. But actually that enterprise has failed. But while it looked like it might succeed, philosophers used their tremendous intelligence to make themselves irrelevant and inaccessible to ordinary people.
Sin embargo, la filosofía nació en la calle, nació en el ágora de alguna manera, nació en la polis, nació en la ciudad. Y las figuras primeras de los primeros filósofos, yo me los imagino a esos filósofos caminando, circulando con otros, dialogando con otros. ¿Cómo era la filosofía en el alba de la civilización, en el comienzo de la civilización?
Well, we can imagine it just as you say. The dawn of civilization didn't produce philosophers. It produced myth. When we sat around campfires at night and invented stories to explain the origins of things, this is the period of mythos. And it gave rise to logos, I think later that same day, in the morning sometimes. Not in the dawn, but in the morning, on the coffee break. Philosophy appeared in the ancient city-state of Athens, as you said, in the agora, which also means the marketplace. Not just the public square, but a place for transaction. And not just transaction of material things, but transaction of ideas. And it continued at the same time it was developing in India with the forest sages who also wandered on pilgrimages, learning and teaching. And in ancient China too, we had Confucius attempting to convince the warlords of his day that government by virtue was superior to government by coercion. He was obviously ahead of his time. And his contemporary Lao Tzu apparently applied the Tao to his practice of civil service in his province. So you see these roots go back to our very earliest times of what we today call civilization.
Qué impresionante que este nacimiento del pensamiento haya surgido del pensamiento más fundamental, más fundante. Pienso en Sócrates, Lao Tse, Confucio, Buda, se haya producido prácticamente en un tiempo contemporáneo, en una sincronía temporal. ¿Qué reflexión le merece eso a usted?
Yours. I have the same thought, that if Jung could come back, Carl Jung, he would say this absolutely was synchronous and therefore also purposive too, not an accident, not a coincidence. It happened perhaps for very important reasons. But it also needed some stability and some luxury in order for us to have a meal and a roof and clothes and really have a little bit of luxury to be able to use the nobler parts of our brains to contemplate such things.
¿Qué es lo que trajo, qué hizo aparecer la filosofía en Occidente? ¿Qué trajo que no teníamos antes? Y que de alguna manera cambió nuestra vida, nuestra manera de ser, la manera de ser hombres en la Tierra.
Well, this is a very complicated question, and the history of ideas has been studied and written about at length by scholars and by philosophers too. We have to credit the Roman Empire with carrying the Greek ideas very far. And also, after the fall of Rome, of course, we we have to credit the church to a certain extent because philosophy and theology were close for a very long time. And we also have to credit the ancient Islamic world for preserving many of the important ideas from Greek and from Roman civilization in Arabic during the Dark Ages. Chinese civilization also was at least 5,000 years old, and they have carefully preserved their writings too. So there's been a lot of effort involved, a lot of movement, a lot of evolution, but also conservation of the important texts and their elaboration by subsequent generations.
El título de este libro suyo, el que produjo más impacto, yo me acuerdo haberlo visto una vez en la librería pasada y me saltó Más Platón y Menos Prozac. Es un título provocativo. De alguna manera coloca de un lado la figura del pensador fundamental de Occidente, que tiene que ver con las ideas, con el espíritu, etc. Y de otro lado esa pastillita creada por nuestro mundo tecnológico que pretende solucionar una enfermedad, la depresión. Me gustaría que me explicara qué hay detrás de esta confrontación o de este duelo entre estos dos titanes, Platón y Prozac.
This is a very old kind of dualism. You can think of it as having its roots in Descartes, if you like, the dichotomy between the mind and the body. And these are interacting domains, I believe. No one can really explain how they interact, but it's very clear that if the body is not healthy or is in an ill state, then the mind is affected and we're less than functional. But also, we have the power to affect our bodies for better or worse by the contents of our minds too. In general, I have seen in the last half of the 20th century a great development of science and technology in the West, which has on the one hand increased life expectancy and made all kinds of alternatives available to people, but on the other hand has tended to make people over-dependent on external things for their own well-being. And in America in particular, and owing to globalization in general, there has been a spread of this idea that the solutions to all our problems lie outside ourselves. And beyond that, the pharmaceutical industry, to be very candid with you, has colonized and lobbied the psychiatrists and the clinical psychologists to turn them into diagnosticians. Every possible human complaint or discontent is now potentially a disease that is diagnosed, and of course where there's a diagnosis, there's a drug. So we have a generation of essentially licensed drug pushers who are helping to spread this. It's very good for business on the one hand, but not so good for the human soul and the human mind on the other.
De hecho han aparecido multitud, miles de enfermedades nuevas, de clasificaciones, de taxonomías, de enfermedades, incluso algunas de nombres muy ridículos. No sé si usted podría dar algún ejemplo, pero qué sé yo, uno tiene un problema con un hijo y aparece el síndrome, un problema con un hijo, el síndrome, el problema con el hijo adolescente. Hay pastillas que han aparecido ya en el mercado para situaciones que antes se curaban a lo mejor con la sabiduría del abuelo en la familia o con qué sé yo.
That's right. And you've raised lots of issues, but I mean, part of the problem of the success of the Enlightenment project has been the success of individuals and the transcendency of the individual over the family and over the community. But it's gone to an extreme now, where in search of ourselves, we're willing to disregard other people, and this undermines the social fabric in a severe way. But your main point is very well taken. If an adolescent is rebellious, merely being what we all are in puberty, which is reckless and disobedient and testing the limits of authority in order to discover our own limitations, this becomes diagnosed as an illness. And children are being drugged with Ritalin. 15 million American children every day are being drugged with Ritalin. And if the parents disagree with this treatment, this is also diagnosed as a disease. It's called non-compliance with treatment disorder. So if you agree with the system, you're diagnosed and drugged. And if you disagree with the system, that's just one more illness. So people lose the capacity to exercise points of view or to think independently. We all become cogs in this great technological machine.
Voy a hacer una pregunta bien directa y bien prosaica. Voy a aterrizar esto. ¿La filosofía puede curar la depresión? ¿Puede ser una alternativa, por ejemplo, a la psicología, al psicoanálisis y al Prozac, efectivamente? ¿Y en qué sentido? Me gustaría que me explicara eso.
Those are 5 questions, I think, but cure, no. I would not say that we are curative. I would say that we can do what Socrates hoped can be done, and that is to be midwives who induce the inner wisdom of our clients to cure themselves. That's definitely something that works. We are not seeking to replace psychology or psychiatry or psychoanalysis. These are all important pathways for understanding different aspects of ourselves, but we are functioning as an alternative that has been missing for a very long time. If you go to New York, or I'm sure on the streets of Santiago, you will find people who are undoubtedly mentally disturbed. We are not denying the validity of mental illness. If I take you on a tour of the New York subway, then you'll see people who need Más Prozac y Menos Platón, inevitably. But seriously, for most of us, there's a great power in ideas, and the philosopher has the ability to awaken ideas in the mind. In the long run, we are governed by our principles, not just by our appetites and our emotions.
Aparece una nueva figura, digamos, a ver, si alguien, cualquier ser humano tiene un problema, o, a ver, de sentido, o de tristeza, o de depresión, puede que esté el cura en la iglesia. Antes existía el cura en la iglesia, el confesor. Bueno, luego llegó el psicólogo, el psiquiatra, el médico, el psicoanalista, el chamán, bueno, hay una cantidad, ¿no?, de figuras nuevas. Y aparece esta nueva figura, que es el consultor filosófico. ¿Qué hace un consultor filosófico?
Let me give you a metaphor, if I may. Okay? Suppose you have a stone in your shoe, obviously causing you some discomfort. So maybe a figure from organized religion will tell you that you're born with a stone in your shoe, and it's your penance to carry this stone in your shoe all your life and hope in the next life that the stone will be removed by God. Someone else, maybe the psychologist, will ask you, how do you feel having a stone in your shoe? Tell me all about the emotions of having a stone in your shoe. And maybe the psychoanalyst is going to say, you know, when you were a little child, you know, tell me how you came to have this stone in your shoe, and what makes you say that you have one anyway, and all of this sort of questioning. A philosopher is much more likely to tell you, especially an American pragmatist like myself, take the stone out of your shoe and then start living.
Ahora, no toda la filosofía es pragmática. Y aquí me gustaría quizás hacer un recorrido por la historia de la filosofía, ir viendo cómo en la historia de la filosofía, en los grandes pensadores, hay recursos tal vez para enfrentar problemas que no necesariamente son síndromes ni enfermedades que nos lleven al psicólogo o al psicoanalista. Y quizás podríamos partir desde muy atrás. Partamos del principio. Ya hablamos de Sócrates, pero partamos de Platón. Tal vez reivindiquemos un poco a Platón, puesto que ha sido tan golpeado en el último tiempo y tan desprestigiado por la filosofía postmoderna, ¿no es cierto? ¿Qué es lo que hay en Platón o en la filosofía de Platón como recurso para mejorar nuestra vida? Para vivir mejor, digámoslo directamente.
Sure, well, living better is one of the goals. In the ancient world, philosophy was a guide to the art of living. The whole idea was to treat life as an art form, perhaps the grandest art form, and to make of your life a work of art. And so, of course, we need aesthetic guidance and ethical guidance and other things in order to do this. Plato, I think, is in such disrepute with the postmodernists because Plato asserted the existence of reality. If we remember the cave, in Plato's cave, you have the world of appearance, which is very fuzzy, very unclear, and that's inside the cave. Culture often has this effect on us. Language, discourse, narrative, and all the tools of postmodernism actually chain people to the cave wall and make them think that everything is a matter of social constructs. Outside the cave, there is a world of unchanging eternal forms which illuminate truth and beauty and justice for us. Plato's idea of education was that it would lead people out of the cave, out of the world of appearances, and into the bright, beautiful, and harmonious world of reality, where their souls would be balanced, and therefore where society would be balanced. Postmodernists find this revolting, so they are actually bringing people back into the cave so that they can be kept up against the wall with discourse as opposed to led out with illumination.
Pero, y tal vez aplicándolo prácticamente, a ver, tal vez con un ejemplo, ¿qué elementos o qué idea platónica le ha servido a usted, por ejemplo, para asesorar a alguien en torno a un problema específico?
Well, we'll go right back to what you were asking earlier about these diagnoses of so-called disease in our culture. These 15 million children a day who are taking Ritalin and are being diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit disorders of various kinds. That is an appearance. The symptom is being diagnosed. In my opinion, there's a reality which no one is confronting, and which Plato would demand that we confront. The reality is that the human being, in order to be a functional person, needs cognitive development. And the surest route to that is through the development of natural language, learning to speak properly, learning to read well, and learning to write are all requiring practice and instruction. If you don't do this with children, and instead, as we do in the United States, give them television for 4.5 hours a day, video games, and the internet, visual stimulation will depress their cognitive functions and prevent their cognitive development. Then they can't sit still. And then we diagnose them and drug them. That's the world of appearance. The reality is that the philosophy of education and technology are so impoverished that this so-called epidemic is actually a disease of enculturation. And any Platonist would understand that we're moving further away from the ideal rather than closer to it.
En uno de los libros usted habla de la palabra terapia. Y uno podría hablar de terapia filosófica. Ahora, me gustaría tal vez volver al origen de la palabra terapia. Quizás eso ayuda a entender mejor qué es lo que es terapia filosófica. ¿De dónde viene el concepto terapia o terapéutico?
Yes, indeed.
Etimológicamente.
Yes, indeed. Yes, etymologically, of course, it's Greek, therapein. It means to attend to something. It's very generic. Doesn't say what. So a therapist in the ancient world was just an attendant of some kind. So in other words, someone who parks your car, you know, valet parking really is a car therapist if you think of the Greek. Right? And the idea of therapy is understood by most people. They realize it should be something that's beneficial in a general way. So for example, petroleum jelly or Vaseline was sold as lip therapy. Good for the lips.
Yeah.
There's a magazine I read on an airplane recently called Retail Therapy. So the idea is that shopping can make you feel good. The other half of it is the psyche, psychotherapy. Well, psyche is also a Greek word, which means many things. There's no precise translation in English, no unique one. It can mean the mind. It can mean the soul. Not the divine soul, but the Greek soul. It can mean the breath, more fundamentally than that, just the process of respiration. It can mean the character. So now put them together. You have psychotherapist. If someone helps you attend to your character through ethical development, this is a psychotherapist. If someone teaches you meditation or yoga and teaches you to breathe properly and improve your functionality, that's psychotherapy too. Someone who's teaching you to play the flute is a psychotherapist. Certainly your philosopher can be your psychotherapist. But the medical profession and the psychological profession have appropriated words, appropriated meanings, obviously in order to designate some kind of turf. And so we need to break down these barriers in order to return words to their more original meanings.
Un sentido hermoso de psicoterapia sería tal vez atender al alma, ¿no es cierto? Escuchar al alma, escuchar a la propia alma. Y tal vez ese sea un tema importante en lo que estamos conversando. Normalmente la psicología y la psiquiatría y el psicoanálisis, tengo la impresión, han tendido a buscar las raíces de nuestros males, digamos, de nuestras angustias, en alguna enfermedad o en alguna causa incluso física. Pero hay angustias que tienen que ver con angustias metafísicas, o angustias, incluso uno podría decir filosóficas, ¿cuál es el sentido de la vida? ¿Por qué morimos? Que todos tenemos angustias y que son fundamentales. ¿Cómo?
Yes, but again, you know, it really depends on the reality of the person's problem. This anguish might be, as you suggest, for example, a case of existential angst. If someone really has angst about the meaning of the universe or their purpose in life and so forth, then maybe they really do need help from the existentialists, and that's their source of succor and of deliverance. Or in fact of making the angst worse in order to have a breakthrough, to explore that abyss. Sometimes that's the way out. But on the other hand, it's also true in the United States, for example, that about 10% of people who voluntarily go to psychiatrists for anxiety are really suffering from a neurological disorder. Anxiety itself can be a symptom of an underlying disease, which might be worse. So in an ideal world, in a Platonic world, we would have a gatekeeper, and you would come to this person with angst or anxiety, and they would ask you some questions and give you some tests, and then help you decide whether maybe you should see a physician and be tested for a neurological problem, or see a psychologist because maybe you simply have acute emotional distress or panic, or maybe you just have existential angst, in which case a philosopher is your best route. The best care is always appropriate care. But appropriate care really depends on each individual case.
Antiguamente, en algunas culturas antiguas, entre comillas primitivas, no primitivas, sino que arcaicas, se pensaba que las enfermedades tenían un origen espiritual. Y quizás no estaban tan equivocados. ¿No es tal vez el fondo de todas las enfermedades el vacío existencial, el vacío de significado, la pérdida de sentido de la vida? No puede ser quizás la base de la mayoría de las enfermedades y de los males, incluso.
There's no question about this in my mind. You're absolutely right. I mean, I've been trained in scientific and analytic methods and so forth, but I think that the true philosopher, and that means everybody inside, should have an open mind. As well as exercising doubt for critical purposes, we need to be open and receptive, or else we blind ourselves to other aspects of reality. I think that so-called shamanism has within it many secret teachings which put people in touch with nature and the power of nature. I think that the cosmos contains many more mysteries than we will discover under the electron microscope, or simply with mathematical expressions, however beautiful they are, or in deep space with NASA probes. I think that most of the secrets lie within. And so I'm very sympathetic to the idea of studying the wisdom traditions of so-called primitive or non-technological societies. I'm absolutely sure that they contain valuable insights for us.
Estábamos viendo cómo conectar quizás ciertas fuentes filosóficas con problemas humanos reales. Por ejemplo, Nietzsche, que es un filósofo fundamental en la historia del pensamiento occidental, es como el Platón del siglo XIX, ¿no? ¿Para qué te ha servido a ti, Nietzsche, en tu trabajo consultor filosófico?
I'll give you a brief example. Nietzsche, I'm very careful with him because he's very strong medicine. Like any strong liqueur, we don't want to drink too much. Huh?
Tiene que ser homeopático.
Yes, you have to dilute it many times before you. Yes, exactly. It's that kind of remedy. So Nietzsche, because in fairness, Nietzsche was brilliant on the one hand, but also quite deranged toward the end of his life because of syphilis, I presume. He's also credited, with being the father of postmodernism. I think in a less credible context, the Nazis abused his ideology. He was not an apologist for that kind of thing. I know his sisters sold his letters to them, probably just for money. But, Nietzsche has obviously been taken up by many different kinds of causes, so he's very diverse. I use Nietzsche in the following way. There was an upper middle class woman who wanted her children to have a work ethic, but could not convince them to do any kinds of chores around the house. After all, they were well off. and they had servants to help with these things. And these children were teenagers, and they knew that all their friends had servants also, so no one in their peer group was doing any work, really. So they said, why should I do it? So she had to find a more clever way to convince them to do it. I suggested to her from Zarathustra, and of course Nietzsche says, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. So there's a sense now of taking poison in a heroic way, you know, to develop immunity and strength. So since they considered that any kind of menial work was really poisonous, this could become Nietzschean for them. And it worked. She told them that if they did this and it didn't kill them, it would also make them stronger, and they took the challenge. And this is how she convinced them to do some work around the house, by using Nietzsche. Very unlikely remedy, but true.
La pregunta, le voy a hacer una pregunta ahora no de un caso individual, sino una mirada más colectiva. Vamos a hacer un poco de ficción, de un juego. Imaginemos que usted es consultor filosófico de este mundo contemporáneo. Tiene que, como los antiguos filósofos tal vez, asesorar a los gobernantes. Estamos en una crisis, los políticos se vuelven súbitamente humildes, llaman a un filósofo para pedirle un consejo. ¿Cuál es el diagnóstico filosófico que usted haría de este mundo contemporáneo? Esa es la primera pregunta. ¿Estamos enfermos de algo, filosóficamente hablando? ¿Y cuáles podrían ser las fuentes o pensamientos filosóficos que podrían ayudarnos a mejorar nuestro mundo de hoy, nuestros problemas hoy día, los problemas más urgentes? Son tres preguntas. Tres en una. Combo.
What would I say to the rulers if they were this humble? This is truly a fiction. It's a dream. It's a dream. You know, I shouldn't tell this to your television audience, but I'd probably tell them to find a way to get us off this planet, because I'm not so sure, as a realist, that we're going to solve our problems. I would like to be optimistic in truth. And in that sense, you're right to ask. A lot depends on political will, actually. And the lives of very many people can be affected, for better or worse, by decisions taken by individuals. This has always been true. But now, with science and technology and the power of nation-states behind rulers as never before, they are able to do either greater good or greater harm with the same weight of decisions. So political decisions and economic ones become even more important. A dishonest merchant in the ancient world would probably just put himself out of business by being dishonest with a few people and having a bad reputation. But a dishonest banker today can ruin the lives of very many people by tampering with public trust. So technology and the interconnectedness of the global village gives us much more latitude to do great good or great harm. So I would say to them, first of all, we need to be very careful about what we suppose to be right or wrong. This leads to your second question. When we so-called make our diagnoses or our evaluations of social problems or economic problems, we need to be very careful about what we're identifying as problematic. You know, the way that you ask a question also informs the kind of answer that you get. So it's essential that we formulate questions in an appropriate manner in order to identify what are really the problems and not just the symptoms. This is very complex, but it has to be done. And like Plato, and I risk saying this on an important medium like television, but like Plato, one can also appreciate the importance of controlling, to a certain extent, what happens with media. People depend more and more on newspapers, radio, television, websites for their information of the world. There is so much information out there that we need these executive summaries. We need the 50 minutes or the 10 minutes or the web page to condense material. But the media is so powerful that it also sometimes has its own agenda. And it can inflame intolerance and foment conflicts which are actually needless. And politicians, as much as anybody else, insofar as they depend on the vote, are also at the mercy of people who sensationalize the truth only for profit. So this is a great danger. And politicians also have to find a way to allow for freedom of expression, which I defend, but also not to allow people to become needlessly inflamed and needlessly in hateful states of one another because of what the media portrays to them. Human beings can always sit around the table and dialogue from any two cultures, but if they're portrayed as enemies, then they may become enemies. So that's a great danger too. So what can philosophy offer? Well, a lot of things. If we go back to the ABCs, literally Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, we can weave together a new paradigm for the 21st century, which is inclusive enough to embrace the Western and the subcontinental and the Asian traditions, and also different enough to be able to address different problems in different regions. But I think we need to use philosophy as a foundation to build a new paradigm for the 21st century that will allow the world to feel more unified, more included, and less conflicted.
Pero ¿qué libro, si usted fuera el consultor filosófico global, le haría leer tanto a Bush como a los dirigentes de Al-Qaeda? ¿Qué le haría leer? ¿Marco Aurelio, Cicerón, Epicuro o los chinos? ¿Qué haría leer así?
For Bush, I think he needs a few more simple books to start with before we jump to Marcus Aurelius. Americans, you know, are great people, but they don't necessarily love books as much as the rest of the world. So their educational system is very deficient. I think that Bush would need perhaps some simpler works before he approaches the more complex ones. Or maybe I should give him this. And
Más
let
Platón
him,
y Menos Prozac.
maybe that would be good for him. In his case, perhaps more Plato and less religion. I don't know.
¿Y qué le haría leer usted al líder de Al-Qaeda?
Well, here you're really putting me on the spot. I was in Egypt, you know, in April, and actually I was asked, among other things, to explain, not to defend, but to explain Bush's foreign policy to about 250 Egyptian administrators. And I did so, and we had a really good dialogue. In the end, they merely conceded that they preferred me to Bush, but they didn't necessarily agree, of course, with the American perspective. The problem with religious fanatics, if Al-Qaeda is really that, and I don't think they are, I think they're using religion. I think they've hijacked Islam itself, because I have many Islamic friends who are very wonderful people who, just like Christians who practice real Christianity, are wonderful people. Anybody who practices the core principles of their religion is really a human being in my terms, because they all teach the same thing anyway. But if Al-Qaeda will not talk, if Al-Qaeda's mission is only to destroy us, and in the process destroy Islam's credibility, then what can you say to them? You can only talk to people who want to talk to you. It takes one person to make war, but it takes two people to make peace. But I would say to the Islamic world in general, one book cannot contain the answers to all our problems, with respect, whether your book is the Torah or the New Testament or the Quran or whatever book it is, Bhagavad Gita. Even so, in America we publish 300,000 books a year, and that's not enough to capture the understanding of the cosmos. If anyone thinks that one book does it, I think this is a recipe for misunderstanding.
En este libro y en este también usted acude a dos fuentes, Occidente y Oriente. Y me doy cuenta que usted se ha interesado mucho en el pensamiento, en una filosofía propia que se ha cultivado en China, en paralelo y distinta que la filosofía occidental. Hay un pensamiento ahí evidentemente muy importante, en el mundo hindú también. Concentrémonos también en la filosofía china. Creo que es interesante entender a los chinos, sobre todo en estos días. Hay que entender su cultura y sus raíces, ¿no? ¿Qué le interesa a usted de esa filosofía?
Oh, how much time do we have? This is
Pero usted tiene la capacidad de ser sintético, ¿eh?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's an old civilization, one of the oldest on Earth, and they have great, great traditions. In general, I would say this to you, Christian, that the Chinese philosophy is in one way more intuitive and less rational than the West. Okay? So it appeals to intuitive people more than to the rational side. On the other hand, it's also very practical, surprisingly. Abstruse and almost incomprehensible on the one hand, and yet enormously practical on the other hand. So this itself is worthy of further study and application. And of course, they developed yoga just as the Indians did, and they developed many kinds of practices, which then, as Buddhism particularly came through China, it was transformed and went to Japan and underwent more transformation. Now it's coming to the West and is being transformed again in our culture. So this is a movement of ideas, continues to migrate. In general, though, here's what I find. If you look at Western rationalism, we came a long way and developed very powerful tools, sophisticated sciences, mathematical and logical formulations, engineering, technology, all of that. But there are deep paradoxes in the rationalist tradition, very deep. In fact, philosophers and logicians and mathematicians cannot resolve the deepest of our paradoxes. We can only prove that we will encounter them. That's Gödel. We are guaranteed to encounter paradox. And this really is surprising. At the end of 2,000 years of very rigorous inquiry, we end up with paradox. The Chinese turn it around, and they say, we start with paradox, we assume it. The first verse of the Tao Te Ching says that the Tao that can be defined is not the true Tao. So whatever we say about it, we're wrong. We know it's there, but we cannot capture it in words. So this is both deeply intuitive and also very paradox. And from paradox, as we depart from it, we can do very practical
Y eso a los
things.
occidentales nos cuesta terriblemente entenderlo. Es difícil para nosotros,
Well,
significa un salto, hay que dar un salto cuántico, filosóficamente
Yeah, but
hablando.
East and West is also a fiction, so it's difficult to understand this with the Western mind. But all you do is turn your chair and face the other way, and then you use your Eastern mind, and then you'll see it immediately. For example, if we talk about a beautiful sculpture, in Plato's tradition, of course, we end up with Bernini, probably, or Michelangelo, because they're the greatest realists. They have captured most of the essence of the human form with their beautiful renderings. So we say, this is closest to the pure form. The Taoists say, no, no, no. The perfect sculpture is the uncarved block. It's the block. That's why is that perfect? Because it contains all possible sculptures. It contains an infinite number of sculptures. And so that is perfection. Once you sculpt a block, you actually are including one and excluding all the others. So how can it be perfect? See, it's a very different way of looking at things. Very beautiful, I think.
Bueno, y quizás estaba pensando que el pensamiento chino tiene un gran valor, que es la eficacia. Tengo la sensación de que la filosofía china es tremendamente eficaz. Hay un filósofo francés que se llama, no sé si usted lo ha escuchado, uno de ahora, contemporáneo, François Julien, que escribió un libro sobre la filosofía china y se llama Tratado de la Eficacia. ¿Se podría decir que de alguna manera el pensamiento chino ha sido más eficaz que el occidental? Estoy hablando de eficacia.
Yes. Very much so. I agree with this too. And it comes from the Confucian side of things. Lao Tzu is very metaphysical, very abstruse, and, as you say, difficult for the Western mind to comprehend. But Confucius's effect on the East has been even more profound than Aristotle's effect on the West, and that's food for thought. Confucius teaches practical virtues. In the Confucian view, we each have a duty in life, a purpose in life, a station in life, and only by understanding who we are in essence and understanding our place can we relate to others in a useful and harmonious way. So Confucius teaches that the individual who is balanced can have a balanced relation with others. This creates a balanced family. Balanced families can create a balanced community. Balanced communities can create a balanced state. So in the Confucian system, everything comes from the ground up. And by the practice of virtues, we end up with, in fact, a great system of justice.
Estaba pensando que uno de los síntomas, no quiero decir enfermedad para no caer en el vicio de los psicólogos, uno de los sentimientos más arraigados en el hombre de hoy es tal vez el miedo. Paradójicamente vivimos en una civilización centrada en la seguridad, en el control. Sin embargo, tenemos miedo. Los occidentales tenemos miedo. No sé si está de acuerdo primero con ese diagnóstico.
Well, I agree with your characterization of it. And I agree that the media, not you obviously, but sometimes the mass media does as much as they can to incite that fear, as Michael Moore has pointed out, you know, although I don't agree with him either entirely. However, Westerners deal very badly with death, for example. We expect that our medical technologies will save us all forever. And it's strange to me, people who believe in, you know, religion and in paradise should be willing to die, should be happy to die, you know, so they get to salvation sooner. But not. We're very afraid. People are very afraid of death. And I think that, and that's one of the main fears. People are generally afraid of change. I mean, that's much more of a problem for us philosophers. We don't know the answers about death. I don't pretend to know. I hope there's more than this. Even this is great, but I hope there's more. I don't know, however. But as far as change is concerned, I do know change happens to us all. And some changes are legislated by nature. Other changes are legislated by us. And if people would take the trouble to examine the cycles that underlie natural processes and to understand change in a much more philosophical way, then they would be less afraid when suddenly things today are not what they were yesterday. And they would cultivate within themselves a kind of equanimity which would allow them to encounter change with calmness and also with whatever else is necessary in the situation, whether it's courage or compassion. But fear, like anger, is a kind of mental poison, and I think it needs to be eliminated from the system in order for the human being to function more fully. But we need to feel a little bit. Brave people are also feeling fear, you know, but it doesn't paralyze them, and I think that's the difference.
¿Y cuál sería la mejor filosofía contra el miedo? Alguien llega con miedo a consultarle a usted. Hay mucha gente que yo conozco que tiene miedo. Miedo a perder el trabajo, miedo a enfermarse de cáncer, miedo a... Por eso las compañías de seguro nos acosan todo el tiempo. Usted tiene solo una consultoría, imaginémonos, una sesión. ¿A qué filosofía la remitiría usted o a qué fuente filosófica para combatir ese miedo?
Well, if I only had one session to combat all the human fears, and I could only name one philosophy that was the strongest against it, I would recommend some kind of sitting Buddhist practice, whatever school you like. There are so many. But I think that by sitting and stilling our minds, we can watch the emotions come and go. We can see them as ephemeral, as transitory, whether they're positive or negative emotions, by the way, and then we can remain in a state which allows us to act from very deep levels, not from panic, not from hope, not from fear, not from all the things that normally tempt us. So I would recommend that people learn to sit and be still and understand that sometimes these thoughts that arise and these concerns that arise are just illusions. They're games we play with our own minds. It's the ego's way of really preventing us from being as great as we can be.
¿Sabes, Lou, lo que tú has hecho con tu libro en la filosofía me recuerda lo que hizo un poeta chileno con la poesía? Se llama Nicanor Parra. Y él creó lo que llama la antipoesía, que es, en realidad, acercar la poesía a la vida, a la gente, a la calle. Y dice, los poetas bajaron del Olimpo. Lo que tú has hecho es bajar a los filósofos del Olimpo. ¿Cómo han reaccionado los filósofos, el mundo filosófico y académico, en la filosofía profesional, ante este intento tuyo de llevar la filosofía a la cotidianidad, a la vida, a solucionar los problemas reales de la gente? Me imagino que no tiene que haber sido fácil eso.
In general, well, nothing worthwhile is easy, so, you know, to climb the mountain is also difficult. There are two general ways in which philosophers have reacted. Two ways. The first way, of course, is those who think they're Olympians, and the academics very often think they've taken vows, you know, of irrelevancy or vows of inaccessibility. They want very often that philosophy will be a private dialogue just among themselves. They remove themselves from the ordinary world. But, you know, people have asked for this back. This isn't really me who's delivered this. This is a grassroots demand. Just like people want poets, not every day. You don't want to necessarily live with a poet, but you certainly want poetry in your life, and you want a poet in your village. I think people also have that sense that they also want a philosopher in their lives and in their village. But the academics, some of them, have reacted very badly because they've forgotten that philosophy has two branches, theoretical and practical. The whole is consisting of both. And those who think that philosophy is theory only are misrepresenting the part as the whole. Philosophy is also very practical. So the other reaction has been from many academics who have always wanted to do this, and thanks to a few pioneers, and I'm not the only one, but thanks to a few of us, we have shown a way. So many philosophers in the academy are joining our association, seeking training to be able to render their services outside the walls of the ivory tower to individuals, to groups, and to organizations. And students are coming forward now saying, this is what I always thought philosophy should be, and I want to study it. And we have many demands now from around the world from young, bright minds who will undoubtedly take this a lot further if they're given a chance to study in programs. After all, the university is responsible for educating almost all the professionals that make our society what it is. Why should philosophers be any different? We should also be able to use the academy to train professionals to go outside and deliver a service. And that's personally one of the things that I would really like to see.
Bueno, la filosofía ha bajado a la calle, está volviendo a la calle, y a los cafés. Tengo entendido que han proliferado junto con las consultorías filosóficas los cafés filosóficos. Brevemente, ¿qué es un café filosófico?
Sí. Well, philosophers go into bookstores or go into cafes and basically just meet the public. This is like the agora, which you started with, just the public meeting. And people love this. We can facilitate a discussion and we can entertain diverse points of view and keep it on a philosophical footing. I've been doing this in New York. I did the first one in New York. It's about almost 7 years now. Once a month, that's enough. 2 hours in the evening, I go into a big bookstore. All kinds of people come in. We discuss things that are not allowed to be discussed in the universities anymore because of political correctness. And we discuss things that even many of the mainstream media won't discuss for the same reasons. And people are delighted to have a forum to be able to express themselves freely without being afraid of censure. This is a great service.
Maravilloso.
Wonderful service. It started in France with Marc Sauté, who's now dead. And, you know, it's, as you say, it's proliferating all over the world.
Y para terminar, a propósito de café y de té, traje una taza y me gustaría que contaras una historia muy bella que tú cuentas, que tal vez resume lo que la filosofía puede entregarnos a cada uno de nosotros. Es la historia de un monje tibetano y una taza de té. ¿Cuál es esa historia, Lou?
It is. Thank you very much for bringing this. Normally, we philosophers don't work with props because, of course, ideas are enough for us. But in this case, I don't need the saucer, but the cup is very useful. We'll have to think later what to do with the saucer. But this monk, at the end of every day, before he went to sleep, he had a cup beside his bed, and he turned it upside down. And then if he woke up in the morning, because he knew that one day he would not, but every morning when he opened his eyes, he turned the cup like this again. So the meaning, well, it has many meanings. One meaning is, at the end of the day, he had filled his cup. He had received everything that the day could bring and had given back to the day everything that he could from himself. So he was satisfied. It was complete. It was full. There was no need for one drop more. So he could turn the cup over in peace and empty its contents. If he died in the night, then he would empty his life too back to the earth and feel at peace. Very beautiful gesture of peace, acceptance, and sufficiency. But if he awoke in the morning, a new day brings with it new opportunities, new ways to give and to receive, and so our cup is empty again and ready to be full of this joyous thing and this mysterious thing called life. No baggage. Every day, empty the baggage. Every day, open yourself to receive life.
Bueno, esa historia muestra que la filosofía, siempre se ha dicho que la filosofía nos enseña a morir, pero también nos enseña a vivir. Y vamos a dejar la taza abierta en señal de gracias por lo que tú has hecho con la filosofía, de abrirla y de alguna manera de devolverla de nuevo a la calle donde siempre debió haber estado. Muchas gracias por haber estado aquí en este programa.
Muy amable. Muchas gracias. De nada.
De nada.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.